September 18, 2016. Northern Tanzania. The western edge of the Serengeti, where the land slowly rises into acacia woodland and the air smells faintly of dust, sap, and old rain. At dawn, the savanna looked peaceful enough to fool a careless mind. The light came in soft and coppery, pouring over tall grass and thorn trees like warm water. The sky was wide and empty. The wind moved slow, almost polite, combing through leaves and pushing seeds along the red earth. But the silence wasn't the kind that meant calm. It was the kind that meant something had already gone wrong. I was there because of a caller signal that didn't make sense. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 34 then, a field veterinarian working with a small anti-poaching and wildlife rescue unit that covered a brutal amount of ground with a very small team. We spent most of our lives in a land cruiser that rattled like a tin can, following up on radio calls, caller alerts, ranger sightings, and the small, ugly clues that poachers always left behind: wire, blood, drag marks, vultures circling too low. That morning, the collar belonged to a young female bear cub. Not supposed to be there. Not supposed to exist. There are no bears in the Serengeti, not the kind most people imagine. And yet, for months, we'd had reports from villages near the river, a strange animal raiding honey, tearing into termite mounds, leaving broad paw prints and a musky smell that did not belong to hyenas or lions. At first, everyone called it a joke, a rumor, a tourist story. Until we saw it ourselves. A sloth bear cub, orphaned and transported illegally, likely smuggled in from far north or east as part of a black market exotic trade, then abandoned when it became too risky to keep moving. It should have died within a week out here. The land would have eaten it. But it didn't die. It survived long enough for rangers to spot it half-starved at a water hole, standing alone with its head down like it was trying to disappear into its own shadow. Someone had thrown a rope around its neck at some point. The fur there was rubbed raw. The cub moved with a limp, dragging one hind leg like it didn't trust it. We tranquilized it, treated the infection in its leg, cleaned the rope wounds, and fitted a lightweight tracking collar so we could keep an eye on it until we could relocate it to a sanctuary. We called it Keto, precious, in Swahili, because it was the kind of name you gave a thing you were terrified of losing. I remember the moment the collar signal started acting strange. The night before, it had moved normally, slow circles around a patch of woodland near the river, likely following insects, grubs, and the scent of honey. Then, just before midnight, the movement stopped abruptly, and the collar's activity sensor began to register sharp jolts. Not the smooth step rhythm of a walking animal. Something like falling. Struggling. Climbing. And then nothing. Stillness. For 6 straight hours. That's when the dread set in. Animals don't stay still that long unless they're hiding, trapped, injured, or dead. By the time I reached the location, the sun was already lifting, and the heat was rising with it. My driver, Musa, didn't speak much on runs like these. He kept both hands on the wheel and watched the grass the way you watch water for crocodiles, assuming danger was there even if you couldn't see it yet. We didn't bring the whole team. Just us, a local ranger named Aaliyah, and my med kit. The collar's signal was deep enough into the woodland that we couldn't risk a convoy, too loud, too slow, too visible. When we left the vehicle and went on foot, the air changed. In the open plains, the wind moves freely. In woodland, it gets trapped and turned around, and every scent becomes heavier. The smell hit me first. Not blood, not fresh blood. Old blood. Infection. Wet bark. And something else underneath it. Fear. You don't think fear has a smell until you've walked into it. It's not dramatic. It's subtle, sour, like crushed leaves and sweat. We followed the receivers beeping deeper between the trees. The grass brushed our knees. Thorns scratched at our sleeves. Overhead, weaver birds chattered, and somewhere far off, a lion coughed, a thick, hoarse sound that made the hairs along my arms rise like they were listening. Then Elias stopped so fast Musa almost walked into him. He pointed. At first, I didn't see anything but a tree, an old acacia with a twisted trunk and branches reaching out like hooked fingers. The canopy was thick and green. It looked ordinary. Then I saw the movement. A small, dark shape high up in the branches. Keto. The cub was wedged in a fork where two limbs split. It wasn't sitting comfortably. It was pinned. One foreleg was caught between branches, and the other clung weakly to bark. Its head hung down at an unnatural angle, and the collar sat crooked on its neck. Flies hovered around the raw skin beneath it. And below the tree, in the grass, was the reason it couldn't climb down. A snare. Not around its neck. Not around a leg. A wire noose looped around the trunk itself, tightened and anchored to a buried stake. It was a crude trap, the kind set for anything unlucky enough to step near it. Keto must have brushed it, panicked, tried to run, and the wire had caught its hind leg, tearing skin and muscle. In pure terror, it had climbed, dragging that injured leg behind it, until it reached a height where the pain and exhaustion finally won. Now it was trapped in the fork like an animal held by invisible hands. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what was standing beside the tree. At first, I thought it was a dead branch swaying in the leaves. Then it shifted, and the entire woodland seemed to hold its breath. A giraffe. A full-grown female, tall and calm, her coat patterned like sunlight broken through branches. She stood close enough that her long neck arched over the canopy. Her dark eyes were open wide, alert, not panicked, not aggressive. Focused. She wasn't eating. She wasn't browsing. She was looking at the cub. Watching it the way a person watches someone hanging from a ledge. And as we stood frozen, she did something that made my stomach twist. She stepped closer. Spread her front legs awkwardly to lower herself. Then she reached her muzzle into the branches and nudged Keto, gentle, careful, like she was trying to lift the cub's head, to shift it to a safer position. The cub let out a weak, hoarse sound, barely a cry. The giraffe did not flinch. Instead, she pressed her nose again, slower this time, steadying the cub in the fork so it wouldn't slide. She even used her lips to pull a thin twig away from the cub's trapped foreleg, as if she understood that the limb was caught. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were showing me. Giraffes don't do this. They don't rescue. They don't meddle. They don't involve themselves in the suffering of another species unless it threatens them directly. And yet here she was, acting like the tree belonged to her and the cub belonged to her concern. Musa whispered something under his breath in Swahili, half prayer, half disbelief. Elia's hand tightened on his rifle strap, not because the giraffe was a threat, but because the presence of something so unusual often meant something else was close. Predators. Poachers. Chaos. I raised my binoculars and studied her more carefully. There were old scars along her shoulder. Faint, pale lines, healed wounds from thorns or teeth. One ear had a small notch taken out of it. She looked like an animal that had lived through hard seasons. But her posture was strange. Protective. Her body angled between the tree and the open grass, as if she was shielding it. I took a step forward, slow. The giraffe turned her head toward me, and her gaze met mine. It wasn't human, but it wasn't empty either. There was something steady there. Something that did not want to run. Then she swung her head back to the branches and nudged Keto again, more firmly this time. The cub's body shifted, and for a moment, it looked like it might slip free of the fork and fall. My heart lurched. But the giraffe adjusted instantly, bracing with her neck and muzzle so the cub's chest stayed supported. She held it, actually held it, with the gentlest pressure. Elia sucked in a breath through his teeth. "She's keeping it from falling," he murmured. He said it like he didn't trust himself to believe it. I approached to within 20 feet, then stopped. The giraffe remained still, but I could see the tension in her legs. A giraffe can run like wind, but when they choose to stand their ground, it's because they've decided leaving is worse than staying. I glanced back at Musa and Aliyah. We didn't need words. This had to be careful. If we startled her, she could bolt and knock the tree, or the cub could lose its grip, or the giraffe could kick in fear and kill the cub by accident. I lowered myself slowly, keeping my hands visible, speaking softly out of instinct even though I knew she didn't understand language. "Easy," I said, voice low. "Easy." Keto's eyes were half closed. The cub's breathing was shallow. Its fur looked matted where sweat and sap had mixed. Its trapped foreleg trembled in tiny spasms, the kind that happen when muscles are failing. I checked the receiver. The collar signal was strong. It hadn't moved because it couldn't. And beneath the tree, the snare wire glinted faintly in the rising light. That was the immediate danger. But there was a deeper one too. Poachers set snares. They don't set them and forget them forever. They come back. Sometimes within hours. Sometimes with dogs. Sometimes with machetes. And when they came back, they wouldn't just see a trapped cub. They would see a giraffe standing guard. A giraffe is worth money, meat, hide, tail hair, and in some markets, just the thrill of killing something tall and rare. If they were close, we didn't have time. I signaled Musa to circle left quietly and keep watch. He moved with the careful steps of someone who'd grown up listening to grass. Aliyah took position behind a tree, scanning the woodland edge. I opened my kit and pulled out what I knew I'd need first, a sedative dart, a small blowpipe, bandaging, antiseptic, wire cutters. I hesitated with the dart in my hand. Tranquilizing the cub would make it lose its grip. It would fall. And if it fell with its legs still caught in that wire, it could hang. Or snap something. Or die. So we needed to free the snare first. But the snare was under the cub's leg, anchored tight around the tree. To cut it, I would have to go close, within reach of the giraffe's legs. A giraffe kick can kill a lion. And this giraffe, for reasons I didn't understand, was emotionally invested in what we were about to do. That could make her calm. Or it could make her dangerous. I took a slow breath, then moved forward, inch by inch, eyes always flicking up to her. Her nostrils flared. Her ears turned toward me. But she didn't retreat. She didn't threaten. She simply watched, and every few seconds, she touched the cub again, as if reminding it to stay awake. When I reached the base of the tree, I crouched and examined the wire. It was thick, braided steel, cheap but vicious. The loop around the trunk had cut into bark, leaving a raw groove. The anchor stake was buried deep, jammed into the earth with force. Whoever said it knew what they were doing. Keto's hind leg was caught higher up, somewhere between the fork and the trunk. I could see blood on the bark. Dark and sticky. The cub was bleeding slowly. I looked up again. The giraffe's neck was angled down, her muzzle still pressed to the cub's shoulder. Her eye was wide, the lashes long, and in that eye was something that felt like urgency. Not panic. Not confusion. Urgency. As if she knew time was running out. Then, from somewhere far off in the woodland, there came a sound that turned my blood cold. A low, sharp whistle. Not a bird. Human. Aliyah's head snapped to the side, and he raised a hand in warning. Another whistle answered, closer. And then the faint yelp of a dog. The giraffe's ears stiffened. Her head rose, scanning the direction of the sound, and for the first time she looked truly alarmed. Keto stirred weakly, letting out a small rasping cry. I had seconds to decide. If I backed away now, we would lose them both. If I rushed, I could trigger the giraffe, make her bolt, make the cub fall. Behind me, Musa hissed softly, "They're coming." I gripped the wire cutters in my hand until my knuckles went white, and I slid closer to the trunk. The giraffe lowered her head again, then did something I will never forget for as long as I live. She stepped forward, placed one massive hoof directly over the snare's anchor point in the dirt, and stood on it, pinning it down, steadying the wire, as if she was bracing the trap so I could cut it faster. As if she understood exactly what needed to happen next. The first cut of steel rang faintly in the air like a snapped guitar string. And somewhere in the trees, the dogs began to bark. The sound of the wire snapping seemed too loud for the world we were in. It echoed inside my skull long after the steel gave way, long after the tension in the snare loosened and the loop sagged against the trunk. I froze instinctively, waiting for chaos, for the giraffe to rear, for the cub to fall, for the woodland to explode into movement. None of that happened. Instead, the giraffe shifted her weight with remarkable care, lifting her hoof just enough to let the wire slacken fully. The snare slid loose around the bark and dropped into the grass like a dead thing. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then Keto's body sagged. The cub's injured hind leg slipped free of the tension that had been holding it aloft, and gravity did the rest. Its small body slid from the fork, for scraping bark, claws flailing uselessly. Before I could even stand, the giraffe reacted. She lowered her neck in a smooth, powerful arc, her muzzle catching the cub against her chest, guiding the fall instead of stopping it. Keto's body bumped against her shoulder, then slid down the long slope of her neck until it dropped the final few feet into the grass, not hard, not fast, but with a dull, controlled thump. The cub landed on its side and didn't move. My heart slammed so hard I thought I might be sick. I rushed forward, forgetting everything else, dropping to my knees beside the cub. Its chest rose, once, shallow, then again. The breathing was there, but it was weak, uneven. Blood darkened the fur around the hind leg. The snare had cut deep, and infection had already set in. The flesh was swollen, hot to the touch. Flies hovered immediately, drawn by the smell. I waved them away with my hand and reached for my kit. Above me, I felt rather than heard the giraffe step closer. Her shadow fell over us, long and cool. I didn't look up. I didn't dare. Daniel, Aaliyah hissed urgently. The dogs. They're close. I nodded without turning my head. I'd heard them too now, sharp, frantic barks bouncing through the trees, accompanied by voices. 2, maybe 3 men. The sound of brush being shoved aside without care. Poachers don't move quietly when they think the trap has worked. I drew up the sedative and blew the dart into Keto's shoulder. The cub barely reacted, just flinched weakly. I murmured to it without thinking, my voice low and steady, the same tone I'd used with hundreds of frightened animals before. Stay with me. Stay. I cut away fur from the wound, working fast but carefully. The tissue beneath was ugly, torn muscle, dirt ground into the cut, signs that the leg had been yanked and twisted while the cub tried to climb. I flushed it with antiseptic, ignoring the way my hands shook. Above us, the giraffe shifted again, and this time I risked a glance. She stood over us fully now, her legs planted wide, her body angled so that we were almost beneath her chest. She wasn't looming. She was covering us. From the open woodland, her spotted body blended into the trees, breaking up the shape of what lay beneath her. She turned her head sharply toward the barking. Her tail flicked once. Hard. Musa appeared beside me, crouched low. 2 dogs, he whispered. At least 2 men. They're following the signal from the trap. Aaliyah was nowhere to be seen. He'd moved to intercept, to draw them away if he could. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only one we had. The sedative began to take effect. Keto's breathing slowed, deepened slightly. The trembling in its limbs eased. I wrapped the wound tightly, packing it with gauze, then secured it with a pressure bandage. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it might hold until we could move. Moving was the problem. The Land Cruiser was a 10-minute walk away in good conditions. With a sedated cub, hostile terrain, and poachers closing in, it might as well have been on another continent. I slid my arms under Keto's body and tested the weight. The cub was heavier than it looked, dead weight pulling against my back. I gritted my teeth and lifted. The giraffe reacted instantly. She stepped backward 2 paces, then forward again, adjusting, her head lowered so she could see what I was doing. Her ears flicked, one toward the barking, one toward me. The dogs were closer now. I could hear their panting beneath the barking, the snap of branches under running feet. Musa touched my shoulder. We go now. We moved. I carried Keto as fast as I could manage, muscles screaming, my boots slipping on loose soil. Musa walked ahead, clearing branches, glancing back every few seconds. The giraffe followed. Not behind. Beside. She moved with us through the trees, her long legs stepping over brush, her neck swinging low enough that her head stayed near the cub. When we had to slow for a fallen log, she stopped too. When I stumbled, she paused, her body blocking the line of sight from behind. At one point, the barking surged, loud and sudden, and a dog burst through the undergrowth barely 30 meters away. The giraffe exploded into motion. She wheeled and lashed out with a kick so fast I barely saw it. Her hoof struck the ground inches from the dog's head, sending dirt and leaves flying. The dog skidded to a halt, yelping, then turned tail and vanished back into the brush. A human voice shouted in anger. The giraffe reared slightly, towering, her neck arched, her legs braced. She stamped once, hard, and the sound carried like a warning drumbeat. I had seen giraffes fight before, over territory, over mates, but I had never seen one stand its ground like this, not against something that wasn't a predator. She wasn't defending herself. She was defending us. Musa grabbed my arm. Now, Daniel. Now. We ran. By the time we burst out into the open and the land cruiser came into view, my lungs were burning and my vision was tunneling. Musa wrenched the rear door open, and together we hauled Keto inside, laying the cub gently on the padded floor. I fumbled for another syringe, administered fluids, checked the bandage again. Then I turned. The giraffe stood at the edge of the trees, half in shadow, half in sun. She didn't follow us into the open. She didn't come closer. She simply watched. The barking had faded behind her now. Either Aaliyah had succeeded in drawing them away, or they'd decided this hunt wasn't worth it. I met her gaze across the distance. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she lowered her head once, slow, deliberate, and turned back into the woodland, disappearing between the trees as quietly as she had arrived. I didn't see her again. We reached the sanctuary hours later. Keto survived the surgery, though the leg would never be the same. The infection took weeks to fully clear. Recovery took months. The report I filed listed the events in dry, professional language: snare removal, poacher interference, successful extraction. There was no box for what else had happened. No category for an animal choosing, against every rule of instinct, to stay. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that moment under the acacia, the giraffe's hoof pinning the wire, her body shielding the cub, her eyes following every move I made. People ask me why I stayed in the field after that, why I didn't burn out, why I didn't quit. I tell them this. Because once, in a place where survival is everything, I watched compassion cross a boundary it wasn't supposed to cross. And once you've seen that, you don't get to walk away. The weeks after the rescue did not bring relief. They brought questions. Keto survived the surgery, but survival was only the first line on a very long ledger. The cub's hind leg had been damaged beyond clean repair. Muscle fibers were torn irregularly, nerves stretched thin. Infection had burrowed deep before we ever reached the tree. We drained abscesses, flushed tissue, administered antibiotics strong enough to make a grown animal stagger. Some nights, the cub cried in its sleep. Not loudly. Not like pain. Like memory. It was a thin, broken sound that came from somewhere deeper than the throat. I would wake in the dark, sit beside the enclosure, and wait for the breathing to settle again. The sanctuary staff learned not to interrupt those moments. They said the cub calmed faster when someone was there. I didn't tell them why I stayed. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing. The giraffe's hoof. Pinning the wire. Holding the danger still. Word spread quickly. Too quickly. Within days, other rangers began asking questions. Not about the cub, that part made sense. But about the giraffe. About the tree. About what we'd seen. People in the field don't believe in miracles. They believe in patterns. And when something breaks a pattern, it unsettles them. Some said stress behavior. Others said coincidence. One senior ranger laughed outright and said grief makes men romantic. But Aaliyah didn't laugh. He came to the sanctuary late one evening, dust still on his boots, and stood beside me as we watched Keto sleep. You know, he said quietly, that giraffe didn't leave the tree that night. I turned to him. What do you mean? I tracked the area the next morning. No signs of her moving off far. No grazing trails. No dung away from the woodland edge. He paused. She stayed nearby. 4 hours. Maybe longer. The thought settled heavily in my chest. Animals don't linger near danger without reason. That night, I made a decision that went against protocol. I requested the collar data. Not the cubs. The giraffes. We didn't have one on her. But aerial surveys had logged sightings. Movement patterns. Feeding ranges. I cross-referenced everything from the past 6 months. She had been alone. No calf. No herd. A solitary female, moving in irregular loops, avoiding open plains, spending too much time near the river and the woodland edges. Areas where loss happens. Where animals fall. Where traps get set. She wasn't wandering. She was searching. The realization was uncomfortable. We like animals to fit into clean categories. Predator. Prey. Herd. Lone male. Maternal female. It keeps the world simple. Predictable. This giraffe didn't fit. 3 weeks later, Keto took its first supported steps. The leg held, barely. It would never run properly. It would never survive the wild alone. The decision was made quietly and unanimously. The cub would remain in managed care. When I signed the final paperwork, my hand hesitated. I had saved Keto's life. But I had taken its future. That kind of trade always leaves a mark. The following morning, I returned to the woodland. Alone. I didn't tell the team where I was going. I told them I needed air. That part wasn't a lie. The Serengeti has a way of pulling you back to places where something changed. As if the land remembers, even when you want to forget. The acacia was easy to find. The bark still bore the scar from the snare wire, a raw, pale groove healing slowly. The grass beneath was flattened where we'd knelt, where blood had soaked into the soil. I stood there a long time. Listening. At first, there was nothing. Just birds and wind. Then I heard the soft, rhythmic sound of leaves being stripped from branches. I turned slowly. She stood no more than 30 meters away. The same giraffe. I knew it instantly. The notched ear. The scars. The way she held herself, alert but not tense. She froze when she saw me, one foreleg lifted mid-step. We watched each other. I didn't move closer. I didn't raise my hands. I simply stood, breathing, letting the moment exist without trying to own it. After a long while, she lowered her leg and resumed feeding, though her eyes never fully left me. I noticed then how thin she was. Not starving, but lean, the way animals look when they've given more than they've taken for a long time. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe guilt. Maybe gratitude. Maybe the need to give something back to a world that had surprised me. I reached into my pack and pulled out a bundle of mineral blocks, standard issue, meant for injured or relocating animals. I placed them on the ground near the tree and stepped back. The giraffe watched. Did not approach. Only when I retreated several paces did she move forward, sniffing cautiously before nudging one block with her nose. She did not eat immediately. She stood over them first, scanning the grass, listening. Guarding. I returned the next day. And the next. I never approached her directly. Never tried to touch her. I brought minerals, fresh water in the dry weeks, and once, when I found another snare not far from the tree, I dismantled it and left the cut wire in plain sight. A message, for whoever had said it. Poachers returned less often after that. Word spreads in quiet ways out there. Over time, the giraffe allowed me closer. Not close enough to touch. But close enough to see the rise and fall of her chest, the slow blink of her eyes. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, she did something that made my throat tighten. She walked to the acacia. Placed her muzzle against the trunk. Right where Keto had been trapped. She stood like that for a long time. Not feeding. Not moving. Just there. I understood then that whatever bond she'd formed with the cub hadn't vanished when we carried it away. It had nowhere to go. And now, it was tied to a place. Weeks later, when the rains came early and the grass surged green almost overnight, I found her with company. A calf. Small. Awkward. New. The calf stayed close to her legs, stumbling, learning the shape of the world. She kept positioning herself between the calf and the open plains, just as she had once positioned herself between Keto and danger. When she saw me that day, she did not flee. She simply turned her head and watched. There was no gratitude in her eyes. No recognition the way humans imagine it. Only something steadier. Something like acknowledgement. I left quietly. Some stories don't belong to us after they finish unfolding. Years later, when people ask me about the strangest rescue I've ever been part of, I never start with the cub. I start with the giraffe. Because saving a life is remarkable. But choosing to stay, when you don't have to, when nothing compels you but something inside you. That changes how you see everything that follows. The rains changed everything. They always do. The dry season strips the land down to truth, who is strong, who is desperate, who will take risks. But when the rains arrive, they bring illusion. Abundance. Cover. New life that distracts from old danger. Poachers love the rains. Tracks wash away. Grass grows high enough to hide men, dogs, wire. Rivers swell and carry sound elsewhere. Patrols slow. Visibility drops. And animals lower their guard. 2 months after the first storms, a ranger patrol found a body near the river bend south of the acacia woodland. Not Keto. A man. He was young. Early 20s, maybe. No uniform. No rifle. Just wire cutters in one hand and a length of braided steel coiled at his feet. His throat had been crushed. Not slashed. Crushed. The ground around him told the rest of the story. Deep, oval impressions. Wide stance. Drag marks where the body had been pushed several meters through mud before being released. A giraffe kick can break ribs. A giraffe stomp can collapse a chest. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. She had done it. The news rippled through the reserve like a low electrical hum. Some rangers were shaken. Others quietly relieved. One older tracker spat in the dust and said, "The land is correcting itself." Officially, the report blamed an accident, an encounter with wildlife during illegal activity. No species named. No questions asked. Unofficially, patrols doubled near the woodland. I was called in the next morning. Not as a veterinarian. As a witness. They wanted to know if I thought the giraffe was becoming dangerous. I listened to the questions carefully. Was she aggressive? Had she charged? Had she shown territorial behavior? I answered honestly. She had done none of those things. She had reacted. The silence that followed was heavy. Because reaction implies judgment. And that's something people are deeply uncomfortable attributing to animals. She has a calf now, one officer said. That changes the equation. I nodded. It does. But not in the way he meant. A mother with a calf doesn't seek conflict. She eliminates threats. That afternoon, I returned to the woodland. Not to bring supplies. To observe. The giraffe stood near the riverbank, the calf tucked close to her flank. She drank slowly, lifting her head between swallows, scanning the tall grass. Her body was positioned so that any approach from the trees would meet her chest first. I stayed downwind. Watched. Listened. Nothing about her behavior was erratic. There was no stress pacing. No alarm snorts. No false charges. Just vigilance. The kind that comes from having learned, once, that hesitation can cost a life. I thought about Keto. About the tree. About the wire. About how the cub had been helpless not because it was weak, but because it trusted the world long enough to get caught in it. The giraffe had learned something that day. Something most animals learn eventually. That danger doesn't always look like teeth. Sometimes it looks like silence and patience and metal waiting in the grass. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. Another snare alert. Different location. Same pattern. I was in the vehicle within minutes. We reached the site just before dawn. The smell hit us first, blood and panic, fresh this time. A young impala lay tangled in wire, its breathing shallow, eyes glassy. But the snare wasn't the only thing there. Footprints. Recent. More than one. And dogs. This wasn't opportunistic. This was organized. As I worked to free the impala, my pulse stayed high, senses stretched thin. Something felt wrong, not immediate danger, but proximity. As if we were being watched. The impala bolted the moment it was free, disappearing into the mist. That's when the sound came. A deep, hollow thud. Then another. Not hooves running. Hooves striking ground. I turned slowly. She stood at the edge of the clearing. The giraffe. Alone. No calf this time. Her head was high, nostrils flared, ears locked forward. Her body was rigid with intent, every line of her angled toward the far trees. I followed her gaze. Movement. Two men froze mid-step, barely visible through the brush. One held a rifle. The other clutched a length of wire. They hadn't seen us yet. But they had seen her. Fear does strange things to people. One of them raised the rifle. The giraffe charged. Not wildly. Not blindly. Straight. Fast. Silent. I shouted, but my voice was useless against the pounding of her hooves. She covered the distance in seconds, her long legs eating the ground, her neck swinging low, building momentum. The first man fired. The shot went wide. The second didn't get the chance. She struck him with her chest, lifting him clean off his feet and throwing him back into the brush. The rifle clattered to the ground. The first man ran. She didn't pursue. She stopped where she was, towering over the fallen body, stamping once, twice, close enough that the ground shook beneath my boots. Then she turned her head and looked at me. For a fraction of a second, something passed between us that had nothing to do with instinct. Recognition. Not of me. Of purpose. I raised my hand slowly. "It's done," I said, though the words were for myself as much as for her. She stood there another moment, then stepped back, turned, and walked away into the trees. The man survived. Barely. The reserve authorities didn't charge him with poaching. They charged him with trespassing. Official records are tidy things. They don't like animals that break rules. Within a week, the order came down. The giraffe was to be relocated. For her safety, they said. For the calves. To prevent further incidents. I argued. Hard. I said she wasn't dangerous, she was responding to pressure humans had created. I said removing her would create a vacuum. That poachers would return the moment she was gone. They listened politely. Then they signed the papers. The relocation team was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I went to the woodland one last time before they came. She was there, standing near the acacia, the calf pressed close. I didn't approach. I didn't bring supplies. I just stood and watched the light move through the leaves, watched her breathe, watched the calf mimic her movements clumsily. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked at me and did not turn away. She held my gaze. Long. Steady. And in that moment, I felt something that scared me more than any charging animal ever had. I felt like I was about to watch a mistake happen. And I knew, without proof, without data, that the land would remember it. The relocation began at first light. Helicopters thudded low over the grass, their sound unnatural, slicing the quiet into pieces. Trucks followed, heavy and deliberate, carrying crates reinforced with steel and rubber. Men moved with practiced efficiency, voices clipped, eyes fixed on procedures. To them, this was routine. To the land, it was an intrusion. I stood at the edge of the operation zone, hands clenched at my sides, watching the woodland that had become a boundary between two worlds. The giraffe and her calf were still inside it. I could see their shapes through the trees, tall and small, moving together. She knew something was wrong. Animals always do. The first tranquilizer dart struck her shoulder cleanly. She jolted, turned sharply, eyes wide, and immediately positioned herself between the calf and the men. A second dart hit. Then a third. She did not run. She stood. The calf pressed against her legs, confused, stumbling as her body began to betray her. She lowered her neck, touching the calf once, firmly, the way she had once touched Keto in the tree. Then her knees buckled. The ground shook when she fell. The calf cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the rotor noise and went straight through bone. Men rushed forward, working fast, voices louder now, urgency replacing routine. They restrained her gently but efficiently, blindfolding her eyes, securing her legs. The calf was sedated last, trembling before it collapsed beside her. I felt sick. Not because of the process, but because of the certainty settling in my chest. They loaded her onto the transport vehicle with care, adjusting straps, checking vitals. Everything was done by the book. And yet, something essential was being removed. As the convoy pulled away, the woodland fell silent again. Too silent. Days passed. Then weeks. The acacia stood empty. No mineral blocks were touched. No fresh dung appeared. The grass grew tall and undisturbed around the tree, as if even the smaller animals avoided the space. And then the snares came back. Not immediately. Poachers are patient. They test boundaries the way water tests cracks. First one snare. Then two. Then a cluster near the river bend. Patrols cut them down as fast as they could, but for every wire removed, another appeared deeper, smarter, better hidden. The land had lost its deterrent. The giraffe and her calf were relocated hundreds of kilometers away, into a protected reserve with fences, monitoring, and rules. I visited once, months later. She was alive. Healthy. But different. She kept distance from everything, other giraffes, keepers, vehicles. The calf stayed glued to her side, skittish, alert in a place where alertness was no longer required. They had survived. But something had been taken from them. Back at the original woodland, loss accumulated quietly. An antelope here. A warthog there. Then, one morning, a ranger radioed in with a familiar, dreaded tone. Tree. Acacia. Cup-sized body. My chest tightened as I drove. But it wasn't a bear cub. It was a young baboon, caught in a snare set too close to the trunk. Dead by the time they found it. I stood beneath the branches, looking up at the empty fork where Keto had once been trapped. I thought about how close everything had come to ending that day. How easily the cub could have died. How easily the giraffe could have walked away. How she hadn't. People talk about nature as if it's a system of rules. Predator and prey. Instinct and survival. But rules don't explain choice. They don't explain staying when leaving would be safer. They don't explain standing between danger and something weaker when there's no reward for doing so. Years passed. Keto grew. The cub became a bear with a limp and a thick scar that never faded. It learned routines, adapted to its enclosure, learned to trust hands that fed it. Children came to see it. Rangers used its story to teach about snares, about responsibility, about consequences that ripple outward. They called it a symbol. But symbols are safe things. They don't require us to change. The giraffe story was never put on a sign. There were no photos displayed. No educational talks built around her name. Because her story was uncomfortable. It suggested that responsibility doesn't stop at species. That protection isn't ownership. That sometimes the land produces its own guardians, and removing them has a cost no report can calculate. On my last day in the field, before I handed in my radio and my badge, I returned to the acacia one final time. The tree was older now. Thicker. The scar in the bark had faded to a pale memory. I placed my hand against the trunk and stood there, listening to the wind move through leaves, to insects humming, to life continuing in spite of everything. I thought of the giraffe's hoof pinning the wire. Of her neck bracing a falling cub. Of her body standing between dogs and men and something that could not defend itself. Not because she was trained. Not because she was told. But because something inside her said, this matters. We like to believe compassion is ours alone. That it belongs to language and morality and rules written down. But out there, in a place where survival is everything, I saw it rise without words, without expectation, without hesitation. And I understood something that has stayed with me ever since. The world does not need us to be saviors. It needs us to notice when something else already is. And to have the humility to let it stay.